Positive Change Through Whistleblowing, a study of Peter Buxton and the Tuskegee Study. The Tuskegee Study is a medical study that began in 1932 in the state of Alabama, and specifically in Tuskegee, which is located in Macon County, Alabama. In the early 1900s, the people of Macon County, Alabama were only a few generations away from slavery, with approximately 80% of the population being black and with many working as sharecroppers or cotton pickers with very low household incomes. It is estimated that at the time, approximately 35% of the population in this county had syphilis, and due to financial constraints or lack of access, most were unable to receive what used to be the long and intense treatment for syphilis. At the time, there was strong scientific racism within the scientific community, as expressed by Telford Clark in this quote, where he states that Macon County is a natural laboratory, a ready-made situation. The rather low intelligence of the black population, depressed economic conditions, and the common promiscuous sex relations not only contribute to the spread of syphilis, but the prevailing indifference with regards to treatment. And so in 1932, the United States Public Health Service, along with Tuskegee University, managed to justify a short-term, 6-month study, which then turned into a 40-year study of how untreated syphilis affects the bodies of black men. For recruitment to this study, none of the men were told that they had syphilis, only that they had quote-unquote bad blood, and that by being a part of this study, they would receive free treatment for their quote-unquote bad blood. Over the course of this study, 600 black men were recruited and tested upon for up to 40 years without their informed consent. Of these men, 399 had syphilis and 201 were control subjects. These men were given placebo medication and underwent regular blood tests, x-rays, and spinal taps. And finally, they would undergo autopsies when they died. To incentivize men to continue to get testing, they were even given hot meals, and to incentivize the allowance of autopsies, the government would cover their funeral expenses. 10 years into the study, researchers provided doctors in Macon County with lists of their subjects and asked them to abstain from treating them. And when the state was drafting during World War II, these men were given exemptions so that their syphilis would remain untreated. Once penicillin was discovered as a treatment for syphilis, and treatment became publicly funded in the late 1940s, the researchers prevented the men from getting treatment and argued that their syphilis had progressed too far for penicillin to be helpful. All of this occurred without informing the subjects that they had syphilis. By 1972, 40 years later, only 74 of the test subjects were still alive. 129 patients have died of syphilis or its complications, 40 of their wives had been infected, and 19 of their children had acquired congenital syphilis. And in 1966 is when the study takes a turn through the involvement of whistleblower Peter Buxton. At the time, Buxton was a 29-year-old Jewish immigrant from the Czech Republic who had settled in San Francisco. Buxton was a social worker and epidemiologist who worked for the United States Public Health Service as an interviewer searching for people who had syphilis but didn't know it in order to get them treated. One day at lunch, a senior colleague told him about the Tuskegee study and how these men were being withheld treatment, and Buxton was shocked. Interestingly, while the Tuskegee study is secret science in regards to the lack of informed consent for the study participants, the study was not seen so much as a secret from the scientific community. With 13 academic peer-reviewed articles having been published regarding its findings between 1936 and 1973, this study was accessible information and was an open secret which had been accepted within the medical community. Scientific racism was very normalized within the scientific community, and since attitudes changed slowly, this study was justified and legitimized to such an extent that as social changes occurred, the Tuskegee study was not the victim of much scrutiny and did not ring many alarm bells. The fact itself that Buxton had this study shared with him through a story at lunchtime on the other side of the country from Alabama shows the extent of the normalization of this study within the community. However, with Buxton himself being Jewish, whose family had fled the Czech Republic in the shadow of World War II only a couple decades before, and with him being a social worker directly working with treating syphilis, the information he learned regarding the study was shocking and unacceptable. After learning of this study, Buxton submitted several protests to his superiors at the CDC and Public Health Service regarding the study and its particular volatility, considering the United States was experiencing the civil rights movement at the time. But he was ignored. And so in 1972, 5 years after he originally learned this information, and as the scientific community had accepted this study as one of its own, Buxton set out to share the study in order for it to face a public trial. Buxton shared the set of documents he had compiled with a journalist, and from there, front-page articles were printed in the New York Times and the Washington Star in late July. While Dr. Bill Jenkins, a black employee of the U.S. Public Health Service Commission Corps, had attempted to get the word out only a few years prior in a small newspaper, Buxton was the one whose story took a life of its own and experienced the big revelatory moment. By February of 1973, the study was terminated. Congressional hearings began regarding the study, and investigation into the study proceeded with vigor. Legislators and federal officials were outraged over the study, and the public were shocked that the Public Health Service had been conducting a study of such a nature without informed consent procedures. In 1973, there was also a class action lawsuit filed on behalf of the men, with an out-of-court settlement of $10 million for the survivors. In 1974, Congress created the National Research Act, as well as the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research, also known as the Belmont Report, which laid out the foundations of ethical requirements regarding research studies on human subjects. The Office of Human Research Protections was established within the United States Public Health Service, and there are now institutional review boards within academia and hospitals who oversee the informed consent process of research studies. And in 1997, President Clinton issued the first formal apology to the victims of the Tuskegee study, with remaining survivors present during this address. There is immense value in looking at this case because it is a wonderful example of what it looks like for a whistleblowing event to go well. The normalization of behavior within one institution with very little regulatory oversight and transparency can lead to gross ethical misconduct and for the normalization of this conduct. In this case, doctors became upset that ethics committees were suddenly coming into their field and disrupting their studies, and yet the exposure of the Tuskegee study showed the public and legislators that accountability and transparency needed to be required within the scientific community to maintain its legitimacy. This case also shows how important whistleblowers such as Buxton can be for legislators, as this branch of the government had not been disclosing very contentious information because they didn't have to. This case identified a knowledge gap between this department of the government and legislators, which could then be corrected for. Lastly, this case exemplifies how secret sharing by whistleblowers can encourage accountability and transparency in the government and promote democratic legitimacy of its institutions. Through this revelation and the subsequent public disapproval regarding the research methods involved, the government was forced to prove that it is capable of change in order to support the desires of the public and is capable of correcting its behavior and reinforcing democratic legitimacy. Thank you very much for watching my film about the impact of whistleblower Peter Buxton on scientific research and informed consent regulations in the United States.